Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar to launch our journal in collaboration with the Irish Centre for Human Rights at NUI Galway and the University of Ulster. You're all very, very welcome with us this morning. So just a little bit on the event for today. We are launching our journal on dealing with the legacy of conflict in Northern Ireland through engagement and dialogue. This journal originated from Glencree's Legacy of Violence programme, which is supported by the Peace 4 project managed by SUPB. My name is Roberta Capieri, and I am the Assistant Programme Manager working with Glencree's Legacy of Violence programme. We have a very exciting programme lined up for you today, reflecting the diversity of ideas and ingenuity of approaches showcased in the journal itself on dealing with the legacy of violence through engagement and dialogue. We're going to have a sample of the perspectives reflected in the journal for you to hear about today, but I would as well push that this is just a sample, and there's a very rich offering in the 19 papers from authors all over the world, from Hong Kong to the US to South Africa to Belfast, who have contributed to this wonderful journal. It is available to download on the Glencree website. I am delighted to introduce Barbara Walsh to introduce the Glencree organisation itself, and then a little bit on the Legacy of Violence programme that Glencree are currently running. Barbara has been at the helm of Glencree's peacebuilding work since 2014. She is chair of the board at Glencree, and I'm delighted to welcome her to speak to you this morning.
Thanks, Roberta. Good morning, everybody, and I'm delighted to introduce this morning's event, the launch of the journal, a mix of 19 eclectic papers, stories, analysis, and reflections on the impact of dealing with the legacy of the conflict in Northern Ireland through engagement and dialogue. I'm particularly glad that this is a collaborative event between our Legacy of Violence team at Glencree, headed up by Roisin McClone and Roberta and team, and NUI Galway, my alma mater, and Ulster University. So for those of us living in the Republic of Ireland and in this jurisdiction like myself, the legacy of what has happened and what is still happening in the northern part of the island and the impact of the conflict is something that is unknown. So today, the journal itself is an opportunity to get an insight into some of the work, that eclectic mix of stories and research that exists there. So I'm really glad about that. Just to say a bit about Glencree, it's almost 50 years old. It was founded in 1974 as a response to an outbreak of violent conflict in Northern Ireland. And it was founded, the group of people who founded, one of those was Una Higgins O'Malley, who was the daughter of the First Minister for Justice after partition, Kevin O'Higgins, who was assassinated by Republican forces in 1927. Her entire life, until she died really in 2005, was born out of a commitment to enabling greater understanding between traditions across this island. And her strapline was, we have to learn to live together on this island. So I suppose in a way, the work with victims and survivors at Glencree is in the Glencree DNA. And the work that Glencree does really has been over those years, facilitated dialogue, the creation of a safe space, hospitality, and also for people who have come to work and to encounter the other in Glencree. It is particularly peaceful and quiet environment, and people have reported that as being really helpful. So today our work continues. We have a strong focus on helping to support dealing with the legacy of the past, but also the present, community and political dialogue work with women in leadership, considering the context that exists at the moment and the tensions caused by the decision of the UK to leave the European Union, known as Brexit, and I suppose the fracturing of relationships that has happened as a result of that. So our work continues to be really supportive of those relationships which are so vital on this island and between these islands as they continue. As you know as well, Ireland is a quite diverse place now. So for the last number of years, we have focused on new communities coming here. Really the same DNA again around facilitated dialogue, working with people and enabling them to be able to engage and do what it is that they want to do, and to help them to make the connections they need to make Ireland their home. So as I said, Glencree has a long history of working with victims and survivors, and it's good to see that experience and learning reflected today. And it's something we haven't really been good at writing up, so it's good to see that. So before the word trauma informed was in the public discourse, Glencree discovered that when people, I guess, came together with good facilitation in a safe, hospitable environment, people heard and listened to each other, and people reported that as being helpful to them in processing what it is that happened to them. So our Legacy of Violence program today emanates from our work with victims and survivors. And in 2016, Glencree successfully applied for Peace Corps funding under the Building Positive Relations strand of the Peace Corps funding. So the purpose of the work was to engage survivors groups to work with Glencree to co-develop and co-design a bespoke process of dialogue and engagement. And what that means is it's not doing something to people, it's doing with them. It's listening to their fundamental concerns and responding out of that fundamental concern in a way that enables people to be able to maybe find a way forward for themselves. So the project started in 2017, and very shortly after that, the Assembly in Stormont collapsed. So the political environment that existed within was probably not the most helpful at the time. And now when we find ourselves in 2020, we were in the middle of a pandemic as well. So I have to say that the team that really developed and promoted this work were challenged to find innovative, creative ways of actually engaging in this project and delivering on it. And I have to say they were not found wanting in all of that. So I'll just finish up by saying a big thank you to everybody. We're delighted that Professor Brandon Hamber is joining us today to share his wisdom and insight, of which he has many. And we're grateful to 4 of the contributing authors. Some of them who have been contributing to the practice and the work of Glencree over years. So it's really good to see that work written up and here with us today. So I hope that all of you today that are here get something out of it and that you enjoy it. And that maybe when COVID lifts that you'll come and visit us in Glencree. Thank you. Thanks, Roberta.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That was fantastic. Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Rory Finegan. Rory is currently a lecturer and associate professor at the Centre for Military History and Strategic Studies at Maynooth University. In his previous role with Glencree, Rory was the assistant program manager for the Legacy of Violence program. It was in this role that he had the vision for this journal to showcase the innovative work that he could see being done across this area in Northern Ireland in particular. So I'm inviting Rory to give us some insight into his vision for this collection of work. So welcome, Rory.
Thank you. Good morning, Roberta, and thanks very much, and Barbara, and indeed everybody, and thank you very much. And it's fantastic to be here at this juncture this morning to kick off the journal and to formally launch the journal. And I'd like to thank everybody at Glencree and the editorial team, who I'll talk about in a moment, for all their help and assistance in getting the journal to this juncture in obviously very abnormal times with the COVID outbreak and all that's involved with it. And the journal, I think, this morning and the academic seminar that we're going to have for the next 2.5 hours that Roberta, Michelle and the team have put together we'll look at the political, the social and the cultural developments in Northern Ireland that encompass the whole legacy of violence project in addressing the legacy of violence to facilitate a dialogue. And I think at this time, in a post-Brexit environment and with constitutional uncertainty in Northern Ireland, is we sometimes forget the deep, deep trauma that occurred during the Northern Ireland Troubles. And it's important to impart that to the younger generation of nowadays, north and south of the border, and indeed within the British Isles as such. And McKittrick and et al., their seminal work, Lost Lives, outlined the over 3,700 people who lost their lives during the course of the Troubles from within the two communities in Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland and Great Britain, and the great tragedy that was, and how that even today at this juncture from an intergenerational trauma perspective that still impacts on society on these islands. And that's one of the issues that has been addressed in the journal. Before talking about the contributors, I'd like to just briefly mention the editorial team as well. I was privileged to be part of the editorial team and that we were able to get them on board. So, people who are really at the cutting edge within academia and in peace and development studies and also conflict resolution. Professor Patricia Lundy from the University of Ulster. Patricia, throughout her career, it's absolutely fair to say, has been an exemplar of so-called activist scholarship. She's looked at key themes and areas from political violence, historical injustice, and the politics of memory. And Patricia was key at the very, very beginning of this project in spreading out the project, literally globally throughout the world, and pulling in all the numerous contributors that we've had. Also, I'd like to thank my old friend and colleague, Professor Ray Murphy of NUI Galway, who is professor there at the Centre for Human Rights in Galway. He has worked at the Al-Haq University in Palestine. He's also been a Fulbright scholar at the Human Rights Watch in New York. The whole issue of human rights is at the core of his work that he's undertaken down through the years. He was involved in the development of the International Human Rights course at the UN Training School in NUI as one of the seminal team that got that going. And he's a former captain in the Defence Forces as well. So I'd like to thank Ray also. Also, two other colleagues that came on board, also from University of Ulster, was Dr. Niall Gilmartin, fellow Mead man. Niall looks at the whole issue of conflict and peace studies in his work, and also has done a huge amount of work in the area of gender and armed conflict, which is an often forgotten area when you're looking at conflict studies as well. And he's producing this year with Manchester University a joint work, A Generation After the Good Friday Agreement, which I think will be a major contribution to this field as well. Also, Dr. Philip McDermott. Philip, another UU candidate from Belfast. Philip's speciality is in heritage and identity. And back in 2015, Philip was a Charlemagne Scholar at the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin. Because of the professionalism, they have brought us to a stage in conjunction with the contributors that we now have 19 very, very fine pieces of work that are academically benchmarked to the very highest standards. Last but not least, without rattling on or Maureen, I want to talk about what, in my view, are the VIPs, the very important persons as part of the conference this morning, and that is the contributors themselves, without whom we wouldn't have the journal. And to thank them both personally and professionally on behalf of the editorial team for submitting themselves to the whole arduous process that was the review process, and also submitting articles that are of such a high standard and for such a broad multidisciplinary spectrum in this whole area of conflict and peace studies. As Barbara has mentioned, they come from literally a global audience from Hong Kong, the island of Ireland, the United Kingdom, USA, and South Africa. And I think it's this very multicultural diversity that they bring to bear that reflects the richness of the themes explored. And if anything, I feel finally enhances the journal. So other than that, I just want to again thank everybody for putting together the seminar today, all the background work that went into it. I hope everybody enjoys it. And I really hope that metaphorically, whether it be the e-copy or the hard copy, that the journal will contribute down through the years in this such important work of peace and conflict studies. Thank you very much. Good morning.
Thank you, Rory, for that. And of course, to acknowledge primarily your work in getting this all off the ground. It wouldn't have happened without you, of course. So next, I would like to welcome Professor Brandon Hamber.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for the invitation. I would like to begin by just congratulating Glencree and the team and Roisin and all of you at Glencree, not only for your brilliant work over the years, but of course for producing this new journal, which really for me is actually a book that brings together practice and theory, and it's a fantastic resource. And in fact, I was in between things there, busy uploading it online for my students. I have to give a class at 11 o'clock, and so I've already put it on their list for them to be looking at. So it's a fantastic resource. My congratulations also to the editors who we heard a little bit about before this. It's a great job. And of course, congratulations to all of the authors. I won't be able to name you all, but it's a fantastically rich collection. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the collection before making some comments really around the peace process and also around dealing with the legacy of the past, which is very much our theme today. But I wanted to use the journal as the starting point because I think this journal tells its own story. And it tells a very important part of the story of the Northern Ireland peace process. And it tells the story of what civil society, what community groups have been doing over the years. And it's an incredibly diverse amount of work, really rich, creative, risk-taking. It advances the links between theory and practice. And it's innovative. And I believe that is all evident in this collection, whether it's the essays which look at gender, for example, the voices of loyalist and unionist women, which have been very much silenced in the peace process. There's a range of work which looks at art and creativity, from the use of photography through to virtual reality and photo books, papers that look at the role of memorialization in the peace process, youth and intergenerational work, a host of papers on dialogue and mediation and critical mediation, which people from Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland are really global experts in now. That they touch, the essays touch on critical issues to the peace process, whether it's housing and urban planning and the role of churches. So it's an incredibly rich resource. But why I wanted to highlight all of that was really just to stress the significant contribution that has been made to this peace process by civil society. And I think that what this collection embodies is really what we talk about when we say it is a peace process. It's the process stuff, the hard stuff, the stuff that takes a really long time. And it's not just about putting structures in place like new political institutions, but it's about that grassroots work that really recognizes the very deep pain and hurt that still exists within the society, and how identities and perceptions of one another have been so deeply fragmented given the conflict. And so, that's the story I just wanted to highlight, and also how hard it is and how long many people have been working at it. And at the risk of it sounding like a name drop, and quite a big one in peace circles, but we hosted the Dalai Lama in 2013, and I recall someone from the audience standing up and saying, we're really tired. This has been a really long road, and we're still working at the peace. When do we stop? When do we stop? And in his own sort of wise way, he just said, I'm sorry, but you really don't have a choice. You just have to continue. And I think this journal tells that story of all the people who have just continued and kept chipping away and working. And essentially what I would call creating the glue that is holding many communities together. And in that sense, this collection for me is a very hopeful global resource for many people to look at. So it's about examples from below. And now I want to add the but. But the but is that unfortunately at the moment, this hard work that's been going on in the grassroots is not really matched by what's happening, what we might call at the top level or the political level, where frankly the process has stagnated. We've let trust sneak in. The relationship building work that so much of this work highlights has not been taking place. The dynamism we saw in the late 1990s is no longer there. There's been a significant failure to address the underlying issues of residential and educational segregation. Of course, there have been some economic developments, and we know the challenges COVID has presented and Brexit has presented. But I still don't think people have fully got their head around the disproportionate impact on communities who've been most affected by the conflict economically, and of course, the border regions. And at this stage, it would be safe to describe the top-level peace process as a reactive one, and one that unfortunately is still very much dominated by a tit-for-tat type of politics. And I think that, frankly, a lot of people are taking the peace process for granted. In that regard, maybe it's a bit glib to say it, but in this the context of COVID, but the peace process at the top level really does need a booster shot in the arm. And unless the top process and the grassroots that we're seeing today are working together, the impact is always going to be limited. And I wanted to now just turn to the issue of dealing with the past as a way of demonstrating the argument that I'm making about this stagnation and this gap between what's been happening at the community level compared to at that so-called top level. When I first worked in Northern Ireland in 1996, the first question I was always asked is, did Northern Ireland need a South African-style Truth Commission? And the thing that is startling is nearly 25 years later, it's normally the first question I still get asked. And this really points to the real failure to take on those issues at a systematic level. As we know, and we can see from the journal, people are taking it on at a grassroots level, but there is still not a holistic, overarching process to deal with the past. And I don't need to go through the litany of different consultations, different documents that have been produced over the last 20 years, incredibly rich, fascinating material for those of us who study these sorts of things. But at a practical level, it has not really delivered. And I cannot even begin to imagine how frustrating and painful that must be for those who are victims and survivors of the conflict. So it's a long and protracted and, dare I say, shameful tale of delay and avoidance when it comes to dealing with the past. This doesn't really mean that a South African-style Truth Commission is the right answer. The exact structure of the South African Commission, including its ability to grant amnesty to perpetrators who confess to gross violations of human rights, is unlikely to work in the Northern Ireland context. Closing down the potential for victims to get their cases to court or preventing inquiries in exchange for truth recovery is unlikely and arguably unnecessary in the local context here. And the public nature of some of the South African process, people, perpetrators, victims, testifying openly is perhaps quite a tall order to consider within the culture here and the way that politics is done here. The South African Commission had many other failings. I don't think it treated victims administratively in the best way that it could. There was a lot of exporting a very simple language that if we told our stories that healing would follow, and that was a much more complicated process. And of course, what we know is that the economic transformation process is not complete in South Africa. And I think this continues to undermine the achievements of that process. However, on the positive side, by having a systematic, publicly agreed process, what it meant is that for a number of years, we were confronted with the harm, and whether we liked it or we didn't like it, we had to listen to the stories. It then produced 5 volumes of the 22,000 testimonies that were made, and this has become an authoritative record of the past, which cannot be erased, and I believe that that is a valuable contribution. I would argue, however, its biggest success is what I would call creating grey areas. I remember working very closely with a woman who believed her son had been killed by the police. He was a young ANC activist, and in fact, we worked very closely with her. We made some films about her story. And through the Truth Commission, it turned out that actually it was not the police who killed his son. It was his own comrades who believed he was a spy, something which was never proved, but that's what happened. It was an incredibly damaging process for the family and those of us involved. It was shattering, really. So the personal price of truth was really high. But in many senses, the Truth Commission did its job in that context. It revealed the truth, and it was an uncomfortable truth. The Commission revealed many other uncomfortable truths, operations which were called false flag operations, where the state security forces blew things up and blamed the ANC, for example. And so these really complicated cases started to emerge, and it told us about how dirty this war really was. And on some levels, that might be the exact reason that many people would be put off from dealing with this process. But I think the impact for those of us closer to that process was that our assumptions about narratives and about good and bad and were challenged. And I think that unless we challenge and start to undo those narratives and we stop believing everything about our position is absolute and correct, I can't see the past ever being dealt with. So confronting the truth in this way is, of course, risky, it's unsettling, but the foot dragging that has been going on in relation to dealing with the past in Northern Ireland at official level, is that really risk-free? I'm not sure that it is. And every day we hear stories and tensions concerning unresolved cases, issues of contestation over narratives and memorials and commemorations. And of course, victims themselves cannot forget, and we cannot expect anybody to forget. And we know that in the absence of this official process, as I've said, community groups have picked up this the baton. They have tried to fill that gap, but this has all been in the context of political indecisiveness. So I believe that this unresolved past still remains a threat to a stable future. And although this is challenging, and now we have new challenges on the table, Brexit, potential for border polls, international lessons unequivocally suggest that the past will not go away over time. Many countries where little has been done to politically address the past, such as those in the Balkans, remain polarized. Unresolved cases, as we've seen in Chile and Argentina, have now been transferred intergenerationally, and new family members are continuing the struggle for truth and justice. By any international standards, the undeniable pattern of not actually trying to deal with the truth is fundamentally unjust to victims. And I firmly believe that inaction in the past, on the past, is not really a neutral act. It's actually an act of denial of the rights of victims to truth. And in fact, today is an international right to truth day that I'm actually speaking on. So I do believe something needs to be done. The South African process is certainly not a blueprint, and I would not want to advocate it as something we can lift up and use. It had a specific purpose at a specific moment in time. But one thing I'm absolutely sure about is that South African politicians showed leadership and courage to at least make a concerted and holistic attempt to deal with the past. In Northern Ireland, a range of proposals have been put on the table, and I know people have different opinions about these, but we do have frameworks that have been developed over the last 20 years. And so there are glimmers of hope on how this could be done. So from my side, I don't believe any of these proposals are perfect, but surely it is the time for the governments and political parties to show, at the risk of being chased out the room or having my Zoom turned off, to show some backbone, actually, and act in unison, finally, to support some collective process of dealing with the past. And the last thing anybody could accuse them of is rushing into anything. So thank you once again. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it lays some foundation for the discussions today. And once again, just to congratulate you all on the publication. As I said, I really believe it embodies that grassroots level of work. It is the glue that is holding together a peace process that in some levels is currently unstuck at the top levels. And I hope that it serves as a catalyst for us moving this all forward together. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Brandon Hamber. And I just want to pick up on something that you mentioned there, that this journal is aiming to highlight the great body of work being done for peace from all different types of angles. It's really an eclectic mix of approaches that are depicted. And to highlight as well, as you said, that a peace process, it's not an agreement that is just signed and filed away. It is all of the work that is done every day by everyone working towards this, this common goal that we all have. So with that in mind, I want to introduce our first author, Ashle Bailey-Gilreath, who's going to talk to us about art as a means to explore the landscape. Ashle is a PhD researcher at Belfast School of Art, University Ulster University. Her research interests focus on collaborative and socially engaged photography and its usefulness for exploring the social landscape of cultural trauma. So welcome, Ashle.
Thanks, Roberta. And thanks to everyone for attending today and to all those that worked on the journal. I'm honored to be part of this very important conversation. So first, I just want to start off by saying that the expansive research and initiatives that have taken place in Northern Ireland and the community level work that's been done and is being done to address the legacy of the conflict is undeniably important. And while there are many different and effective ways to address these issues, my research pays special attention to socially engaged and participatory arts, and specifically photography, and how these may be used as a complementary method by providing a human-centered and collaborative approach to discuss cultural trauma. While incorporating the arts in general can contribute to the overall discussion on the legacy of the conflict, I think it's especially important to focus on and incorporate art initiatives and projects that are socially engaged, collaborative, and participatory. Socially engaged art projects create an accessible and engaging way to involve individuals and communities in open dialogue about the legacy of the Troubles. This process allows for active engagement, allowing the public to play an integral and collective role in the meaning-making and narrative surrounding such issues. I think this is especially important in Northern Ireland, where many of the residents feel exploited by past research in their communities, continuously participating, but not always feeling as if their voices and concerns are being heard. So what am I talking about when I talk about socially engaged art, and how is this different from traditional arts practices? While the methodologies used by socially engaged artists are varied, there are common threads found with visual research methods and sociological and anthropological research. However, I think the most important aspect of socially engaged art, and that which sets it apart, is the role that the participants play in the work. So socially engaged art balances the relationship between the process and the output, as well as the community and the participants with the art production. So as a result, the authorship of the work is shared between the artist or facilitator and the participants themselves. So the participatory process of creating the artwork is oftentimes as important, or in some instances more important, than the final work itself. These additional methods provide the participants an outlet that allows their voice and personal experiences to be heard in addition to being seen. They also offer a level of reflection that's important for many individuals dealing with the conflict and memory surrounding this. So the emphasis that socially engaged art projects place on the role of the participant is important in order to give a face, a voice, and a personalized narrative to the myriad effects that cultural trauma can have and is having on communities throughout the island. Such projects help facilitate meaningful interaction and dialogue with all sides of the conflict, allowing residents of different communities and backgrounds to better understand not only each other, but also provide a space for a deeper understanding of their own personal experiences and memories. So for example, socially engaged projects could allow residents of different communities and backgrounds to not only learn more about each other, but also share the social and emotional effects that the conflict has had on them and they're still grappling with. Additionally, this may reveal that they face similar issues and have more in common than not. So it's important that all participants work together in deciding how the project is structured, how it's disseminated, and how it would directly benefit them and the wider community that they're a part of. So this goes back to the idea of authorship and that participatory aspect where the individuals are part of the process from start to finish. So the process gives them a voice and a prominent role that some more traditional forms of research and outreach typically don't allow for. So in my paper that's included in the journal, I talk a little bit more about this, but it's important to note that there's a varying degree of participation that can be placed in such projects. The amount of participation is best decided on depending on what the objectives are for the work and why you're carrying it out, and of course, who you're working with. So there's also some excellent examples of the varying degree of participatory arts in the submissions for this year's journal, from participatory photography to theater, poetry, interactive installation work, and that paper especially focuses on workshops. And there's been wonderful initiatives that has been carried out over the years on the island that embrace collaborative arts practices within their efforts to address conflict related to legacy and trauma. So of course, it's important to highlight that there are ethical and methodological issues that need to be carefully addressed when carrying out such collaborative projects, especially in a divided society such as Northern Ireland. So while socially engaged projects offer a number of important contributions to addressing legacy issues, there's still significant limitations that should be recognized when developing such initiatives. The nature and limitations of participation should be carefully considered, and particular attention should be paid to partiality, representation, understanding the meaning of truth and memory, and how this translates to different communities, and the risk of re-traumatization, and the conscientious role that the participants play in the decision-making process. So how can we utilize the arts as a means to explore the conflict landscape? The arts, and specifically those focused on social engagement and participation, offer an outlet that supports and complements traditional methods of outreach by providing different perspectives and approaches. They can provide a platform for raising awareness, for generating dialogue and questions around important and complex issues, oftentimes more so than traditional methods in specific circumstances. It also allows individuals to share emotional and symbolic aspects of their experiences that may not be accessed through traditional verbal or written responses. In instances of harnessing socially engaged and participatory projects, these can address power dynamics often seen in research on social issues and in conventional forms of inquiry. If possible, artistic opportunities where the participants can be in a collaborative and equal position to the artist or facilitators allows them to reflect on the issue in a more meaningful way. And most importantly, the underpinnings of socially engaged arts projects provide a rich platform for healing from cultural trauma and creating a space for open dialogue and engagement, as well as imagining new social forms, new power dynamics, and new social relationships on both the individual and institutional level.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And something that I want to, from reading your paper, that really stands out to me is conflict photography it's such an iconic thing, but there's also so many question marks over whether it's exploitative or not, and kind of people have very different emotional reactions to that. And I suppose the work that you're suggesting really suggests transferring that power to the people who are being photographed and really giving them that narrative power to control their own story and their own dialogue. And I think that it's really, really powerful. So thank you so much. And I really suggest you all go and read Ashley's paper. So next, I'm delighted to introduce Joseph Robinson. Joe is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Geography at Maynooth University. Joe previously worked for Glencree as a researcher with the Legacy of Violence programme, so he's very well known to us. His own research focuses on memory studies, spatial legacies of violence, and transitional justice. He is the author of Transitional Justice and the Politics of Inscription, Memory, Space, and Narrative in Northern Ireland. So Joe's going to talk to us today about victims, survivors, legacy, and memory. So welcome to you, Joe.
Thank you, Roberta. Let me see if I can put my slides up here.
Great.
There we go. Is that working?
It's coming through. Perfect. Yes, we see you now.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to jump right into it. I think this is a part of a larger research program I'm doing that is looking at how and why so many sorts of victims and survivors communities seem to either mistrust or outright reject appeals to reconciliation in Northern Ireland. So this is a photograph from the Unit camp in the land of the Wet'suwet'en peoples in northern British Columbia, Canada. They're occupying and barricading the route of a natural gas, the proposed route of a natural gas pipeline. This photograph is taken in January 2020. At this point, supporters of the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en are facing two separate Canadian court injunctions to lift the barricade and allow construction, and they're resisting. The next month, in February, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police would begin forcibly removing the barricades. In response to what the Wet'suwet'en characterized as a Canadian invasion of their territory, Canada was gripped by a series of solidarity actions and other blockades, including of major rail and transportation infrastructure that ended up costing millions and millions of dollars. I start with this because I want to show you the slogan that was adopted as the quasi-official rallying cry of the Wet'suwet'en resistance. Reconciliation is dead. Now this slogan is particular to the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission and process. I'm not gonna have time to get into all the specifics of the Canadian process, but what this slogan alleges is that the entire process has been sort of co-opted into a liberal public relations effort and stripped of any actual meaning. As long as the government of Justin Trudeau continues its recourse to force to extract resources from First Nations land, what this slogan alleges is that the framework of reconciliation has no substantive meaning. So like I said, most of my work has advanced a critical sort of perspective that's critical of reconciliation as a peace-building paradigm in Northern Ireland. So I wanted to look at these other sorts of mobilizations elsewhere and see if they had any relevance to the Northern Irish situation. Kind of the first thing to note about reconciliation, as my kind of like cursory genealogies of the term would suggest, is that it's a term that's deeply inflected with Christian morality. But I also looked at the fact that there does seem to be two definitions of the term. The first is probably the one we know the most, to restore a person to friendly relations with oneself or another. But the second one I want to suggest is also relevant here, and it's to bring a person into a state of acquiescence with, acceptance, or submission to a thing, situation, or etc. Example, she reconciled herself to the knowledge that that was all there was. So in this, reconciliation is also seen as submission in the Christian sense to God, to God's will, to the unchangeable and inevitable force that's out there. All right. So from there, I looked at this and I went to this guy, Damien Short, has argued that there is such a thing as a reconciliation as a paradigm. Short's work is with the Australian reconciliation process, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And his argument bears a strong resemblance to Canadian critics. Specifically, Short alleges that reconciliation as paradigm privileges social stability over other concerns, that it shies away from divisive questions regarding past violence and the legacies of colonial dispossession, and that it offers superficial recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples and legitimacy of their claims, yet it actively resists substantive political change. in that theater. Okay, so what I was very struck by in Short's work is what he calls the temporal dimension. Temporal is an adjective that means time-based or time-related. It's usually related to sense of perception of time, right? He argues that the temporal dimension is crucial to understanding the cosmetic display of reconciliation, the mere act of freely acknowledging past colonial racism and the promise of future reconciliation effectively reimagines Australia as post-colonial, all right? So he's saying, in fact, Australia is not post-colonial at all. It's still a highly colonial state, a highly colonial reality. But what reconciliation does as a paradigm is it allows Australia as a whole to present itself as post-colonial because they've sought out reconciliation with past crimes. So I'm not going to get too much into this, but chronosophically, your philosophy relating to time, it's long been known that time and control over time is a very pronounced form of social control. And this has been applied in places like poverty studies, in carceral studies, the whole notion of doing time, in queer studies, in indigenous studies, austerity studies, studies of refugee and asylum seekers, and especially in trauma studies, where a lot of people note that the temporality of people who are suffering trauma is often different from the societies in which they live, right? But only recently have these criticisms of dominant social temporalities been extended to transitional societies. And Berber Bevernage's recent book here is a really brilliant criticism that kind of lays bare all the sort of the time-based assumptions we take with us when we look at transitional societies. Bevernage argues that the temporality of the reconciliation paradigm is very much invested in drawing a line under the past, what he calls the periodicization of the past, right? It's in the reconciliation paradigm, the past is bracketed and fenced off from the present. Time is presented as linear and stadial, it is stage-based. The past, which has been overcome, the present, which is transition, and the future, which is liberal democracy. And my work, of course, in looking at state-level appeals to reconciliation in Northern Ireland has shown that this sort of futurity is written all the way through it. But what this does to survivors who refuse to sort of let the past stay in the past, who believe that the past is still very much with us today, is it casts them as anachronism, as people who are out of time, who are out of step with the linear progression of transitional time and the temporal directions in which we should all be going, right? It says the crimes and the wrongdoings of the past are of little relevance in our day-to-day lives because they're in the past. In this anachronizing context, argues the political scientist Jenny Edkins, survivors get our pity and sympathy in exchange for the sacrifice of their political voice. Which is where we get into this concept that I'm developing that's called the temporal hierarchy of victims. Of course, I'm playing with the hierarchy of victims literature that we all know and love, I'm sure. But my argument is that the reconciliation paradigm creates a temporal hierarchy of victims. At the top are those who work through what was done to them in an appropriate amount of time, and then maybe go and seek to understand what was done to them and to reconcile themselves to post-traumatic life, and maybe go and seek out, further understandings of the people who perpetrated harm around them. There's obviously names I could list of people who I think would fulfill that function, but I'm not going to list names. At the bottom are those survivors who refuse to leave the past behind, who believe that who see their victimhood as a pronounced social identity and the performance of their victimhood in public space as a vehicle for political change, right? And I think one of the most important books published in a while that I looked at, that I've put there on the right, this edited collection by Cindy Milstein, I think we need to see resistance survivorhood in public space as this rebellious mourning that she's identifying. Which leads me to my contention in the paper, my kind of warning, I guess, that reconciliation in Northern Ireland is dying. I posit that around the world, survivors are challenging transitional impulses and staged progressions from past to present to future. And they're doing it by bringing the past and the present together. With the victims and survivors that I've worked with over the past 7 years, they're saying to me that this entire that increasingly the reconciliation paradigm is casting them as the problem, right? Them as the problem for failing to move on. And they're saying, how can that be the case, right? So we need to remember that that refusing to move on, refusing to draw a line under the past is often a powerful political corrective to different institutions and political actors who are often far too ready to absolve themselves through temporal periodicization of implication in the crimes of the past. But more importantly, I think, and I'll close on this, is that we need to look at the fundamental imbrications of the past and the present in our daily life. Like, the past isn't past, as Brandon said. It's still very much alive, and that's not we do not look at that as a problem or a pathology on the parts of people who can't move on. So I'd suggest we look at the political deaths of reconciliation in places like Canada, in places like Australia, in places like South Africa, and see what we can learn from them. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. I would like to as well recommend people going to your paper. I think that you have, I think that you have captured this very sensitive area with a great amount of delicacy, but also with precision, and getting straight to the point that matters.
I stopped sharing.
The screen share has stopped. Your video is still up. So actually at this point, we are going to take a very short break. By acknowledging that we are all humans, we are going to take the humane approach of giving everyone a 3-minute break from Zoom to stretch your shoulders, take a breath of fresh air, get a glass of water, and we will rejoin for our next 2 speakers immediately after. So it'll be a 3-minute break, and then we'll be talking to Geoffrey Corry and then Dr. Heidi Riley straight after that. So I will see you in a few minutes. Welcome back, everyone. I saw a great tweet recently about how somebody was really missing during the COVID pandemic conferences, and in particular the bad coffee that is normally served at them and those tiny little mini croissants that you get. So I want you all to pretend that you are sipping bad coffee and eating those lovely mini croissants balanced on the little saucer things. Of course, we were planning to have today's event in person, when it was first envisaged, and the coronavirus pandemic has prevented that. But hopefully we will all be together again someday soon. Back to housekeeping issues. I just want to remind you all to keep those questions coming into the Q&A function. It's next to the chat. You can keep logging your questions in there, and we will be addressing those questions during the panel Q&A once we've heard from all 4 speakers. So great to see those questions starting to come in. And I think we have the function where you can also vote for questions that you really want to have heard, because we won't have time to probably get to all of the questions. So just to remind you to do that as well. So next, I'm delighted to introduce Geoffrey Corry. Geoffrey Corry is a specialist in conflict resolution. He has extensive experience in facilitation work. He has a long history of working in this area. He also works in mediation of workplace, family, and community disputes. His previous work includes facilitation of political dialogue workshops held in Glencree, and he also served as chair of the Mediators Institute Ireland and Facing Forward. So, Geoffrey, you're very, very welcome this morning.
Okay, thank you very much. As you say, I've had either the privilege or the misfortune of living through all the time of our trouble, which of course is a lovely euphemistic term that we developed from the time of 100 years ago of the troubles into the War of Independence. But it does mask, of course, the conflict that has existed and we are still working our way through that. So what's important in terms of a practitioner is to, now that I into my wisdom years, is to try to draw out from the experiences that I've had working with victims, ex-combatants, and others, as to how we do this work, and particularly the crucial work of engagement, the engagement of each side, the victims and their journey that they have been working through, and on the other side, the ex-combatants coming out of prison, that they have trying to work through as well to reintegrate themselves into society. So, but the challenge for a practitioner is when you start going into the academic literature, I've almost been through a 5-year master's or doctoral experience of trying to make some connections between what we've done on the ground and what gets reflected in the practitioner literature. And that's partly somewhat difficult because for victims, there are a lot of untold stories that don't through confidentiality or otherwise, it doesn't get reflected in, quote, the literature. But we are seeing some of that through memoirs. One that comes to mind was Rita Restorick's, who was the mum of the last soldier who died in Northern Ireland in just before or after the ceasefires, and she started a journey, and she actually wrote it down in a book subsequently. On the other side, we're beginning to see from ex-combatants some memoirs like Billy Hutchinson and more recently Pat McGee. So when we come to try to make some sense of, and I'm going to put up some slides now. So our starting point in many ways, it must be the places of the wound. And there are many places. It's such a small space, Northern Ireland, and where families, almost every family has been impacted by it. So we need to honor and acknowledge where these places of hurt, which we're still trying to process and work through. And increasingly, it's now called memorialization. How do we memorialize, and in a shared way, and not just memorialized on one side of the community, their grief, but that together we can memorialize these places of hurt. So when we come into the academic field, the generic term that has become used is peace building, and the theme that I'm speaking under is that, and when we talk about peace building, it has tended to come from the United Nations. We're talking about not only the before in our case before the ceasefires, not just the blue phase where we saw blue sky, the red, by the way, meaning blood and wounds. The blue phase of blue sky sinking when the politicians were able to come together to create what we now know as the Good Friday Agreement, which of course was still not. It was cemented, if you like, at 5 o'clock, but at 4:30, politicians still didn't know whether it was actually going to happen, and David Trimble made a huge political decision to go with the agreement. And we're now in the yellow, what I'm calling the yellow phase, when the sun shines, and hopefully the sunshine shines for everyone, but then we are still in difficult circumstances. So you will, in the journal, there is a very interesting article by Wilhelm Bavert, who worked with us for a number of years in Glencree, and he is challenging the universal term peace building, and he wants to introduce other ways by which we can honor the peace work. So more recently, I've come across a guy called George Lopez, connected a bit with the United States Institute of Peace, and he calls it peace-work, which I think is a great way of connecting with that it's not, the peace building is too much of a transactional term. And we know it took 20 or 30 years to build build blocks of peace that led up to the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement just didn't happen in 10 minutes. It happened over 20, 30 years. And so we need to have softer language, making peace, or as Wilhelm now calls it, cultivating peace, or growing peace, or nurturing peace, a kind of nature-based language that he wants to introduce. But where do we put the verb? Do we put the verb at the beginning, or do we put the verb or tie it in at the end of the term? So that's a challenge, but we need to go beyond. We all need a big term like peace building, but we need to see that peacemaking is an integral part of peace building. Okay, so I've been working a bit on seeing that looking at how we did this work at the community level. We've already heard from Brandon about the work of the TRC, which he says was a very brave attempt, courageous attempt by South African politicians in the early 1990s. But you can see in the picture that it's still a very formal type gathering. You have this big commission of people on the platform, and then you have victims and others telling the truth down among the audience. So that's not so that's top level truth and reconciliation. What we're trying to see is doing it at the bottom level, and we were very fortunate that many of the groups in Ireland were willing to get going, and we've been held back a bit by the fact that there was no TRC in Ireland, and we still don't have the actual implementation of the Stormont House agreements. There's some scope in the middle bit there. It's called the ICIR, where if combatants come along and tell some truth, there is immunity. What's called, the proposal is that there will be a limited immunity. What we need is much more general than that in order to enable bottom-down approaches. So I'm introducing a term called bottom-down. This came from me I was in a seminar in Rome introducing to people and our work, and one of the presenters was the Israeli ambassador to Italy, or to the Vatican, I should say, and he was bringing us through top-down work, and he was talking about the Oslo Accords and showing the difficulties that they had in embedding the top-down agreement. And so he wanted to be able to say, bottom-up, what we need is more bottom-up approaches. But in a Freudian sort of way, a Freudian slip, he said, what we need is more bottom-down approaches. And he continued on this, and we all got a bit glazed over by what he was saying. But amazingly, it was a Freudian slip. It was also a Freudian statement, in a sense, of the nature of this work that we are doing with victims and ex-combatants. And I took that theme away, bottom down, and so my paper has been to try to introduce into the conceptual literature of how we work with trauma, is that it is different from bottom-up work. And my paper makes an argument that we can call this track 4, that it's below the surface. And while I didn't specifically participate in our Glencree workshops I did with some of the victims. I was never at an ex-combatants workshop. It really highlighted to me how we needed to see this work as separate. Again, in the literature, they call it psychosocial workshops. And for me, I always translate psycho into emotional, the emotionality that's there, and social meaning people connecting with each other. So what I've tried to do is how do we plot the journey that people have made, what victims have made and ex-combatants have made. So one of the key psychotherapists is a woman called Judith Hermann, and she set out in a book on trauma about 3 stages. And I took that framework, and so if we're looking at this, you'll find this diagram in the journal publication. Over on the left-hand side, we're talking about the silence that many victims go through of not being able to talk about what happened to them. And here it does connect with artwork and photography and maybe mindfulness. That those are all ways and means by which the trapped emotional trauma inside can get expressed visually, but not yet in words. And the challenge is in working with victims to put it into words, to take from their emotional brain and move it up to their cognitive brain, and to be able to talk about it out loud. In the Glencree workshops that got going after the Good Friday Agreement, we developed a process called peer storytelling, where one victim was able to tell their story to another victim, and that was reciprocated, that the victim became then. So, but the challenge after the closeted work in workshops is, how do you go back to your own community from, say, workshops or your counseling experience, and to speak out, to speak it to your own people, and to be able to tell your story in a public manner. That's a huge stage, a developmental stage. This, of course, is very simplified as a kind of linear stage, learning stages that you go through, or trauma recovery stages. But of course, it's not like that, is it? It goes up and down and up and down. But nevertheless, it is a journey that we need to plot and to be able to put on paper. The challenge is, for a victim, is, are you able to be able to tell that story, not just to your own community, but can you tell it to other communities whom you might see as the enemy, but in particular, can you tell that story in the presence of former combatants? And amazingly, in the years after Good Friday Agreement, I think there was a real hunger to do that, and particularly when prisoners were released in the year 2000, that they were able to do that. So we had little groupings voluntarily that people came into this restorative space. So this second diagram I've done, and I'm just watching the time here.
Thanks, Geoffrey. Yeah, I was just going to say about the time. We're out of time for your presentation now, But do you want to present a little bit about this diagram? And we can also...
Important that we balance it out by saying that this isn't in the journal, it's something I've done up recently. The crucial moment that ex-combatants are having to reflect about is that radicalizing moment, often in their teenage years, when they took up the gun and joined the movement and followed the narrative of their grouping. And so we were very fortunate that many of these prisoners in the maze were able to think through, to reflect on what it was that they did, and in particular to put meaning into why did they take up the gun. In the same way the victims have to take meaning out of the suffering that they have been through. And so we were very fortunate in Ireland that we've had that. And at Glencree then we were able to hold, we had this H vision in which we had the two streams. People thought, oh, should they all come together? But it wasn't, of course, as simple as that. And the fantastic moment was this humanizing moment when the victim was able for the story to be heard and for the combatant to be able to work through what their responsibility and to work through issues of violence. Was the violence futile in the end?
I love the way you play with language as well, introducing the terms of peace nurturing or nurturing peace, changing psychosocial to emotional connection, kind of taking away that top layer of academia and actually bringing it back to human language that we can really connect with and understand. I immediately just kind of have a deeper understanding of what you're talking about when you change the language around like that, it's really powerful, I think, for everybody. Thank you so much, Geoffrey. We are going to jump now to our next speaker, who is Dr. Heidi Riley. So, Dr. Heidi Riley is Adjunct Research Fellow with the School of Politics and Internationals at University College Dublin. She also works with the Department of War Studies in King's College London with the EXCEPT program, which researches conflict-related trauma in Iraq, Syria, and South Sudan. She is also a member of UCD Globus research team that examines European contributions to global justice. Heidi's main research area is in gender and armed conflict, with a particular focus on the interaction between ideology and masculinity within non-state armed groups and the implications of this for women during conflict. As a secondary research area, she also works on issues of negotiated settlement with a focus on women's participation in international peace mediation. So welcoming Heidi.
Thank you very much, Roberta, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. Also, thanks to all the other contributors. It was super interesting, and so this issue of trauma, I think, is really underexplored, and so I really enjoyed Geoffrey's presentation there, and particularly around the use of narratives in trauma. So I suppose I'm going to also address this issue of terminology and language to some extent in this short presentation. But just say I don't have any slides, so I'm just going to talk for the next 10 minutes. So I'm going to primarily speak to some of the points made in our contribution to the journal, which we were delighted to be able to participate in. And this was an article that I wrote with PhD candidate Emma Murphy, and a fantastic colleague who unfortunately can't be here today as she's due to COVID. She had to go back to the US, and of course the time difference doesn't really work for her. So the article really came about from a UCD research project. It was titled Irish Consortium for the Promotion of Women in Peace Mediation and Negotiation. So a little bit of a mouthful there. And we ran this project in collaboration with Mary Montague and Lisa Wilkinson from Tides in Belfast, who I'm sure many of you know. And I suppose the project was developed in response to kind of what we really all know are the dismally low figures that relate to women's participation in peace negotiations. However, I kind of wanted to interrogate and challenge somewhat these figures as part of the project. And if we look at statistics on women's participation in peace negotiations, we can see that they're particularly low. So between 1992 and 2018, women only made up about 13% of negotiators and 3% of mediators. But I think while these figures are clearly troubling, they don't really take into account the full picture of women's participation and the roles that women play in peace mediation. These figures primarily focus on high-level negotiations, which we often term as track one, as Geoffrey was speaking about. But of course, mediation also takes place at all levels and all spaces within peace building and peace negotiations. So if we shift our understanding of mediation to one that takes into account that mediation takes place in all spaces of peacemaking, then the reality is that women are much more present or represented at the local community level, but this is really often overlooked, and it's not really valued often in the same way as it is in high level negotiations. And I think this reality is also representative of Northern Ireland, where although there may be a little bit of a better recognition of some women who participated in high-level negotiations, those, for example, who represented the Women's Coalition, although they're often not included in some of the key dialogues around the Good Friday negotiations, which is unfortunate. But even beyond that, there is much less recognition of the mediative practice, which is used by many other women, a diversity of women who work in and continue to work in community level peace building. And I think if we kind of relate that back to Brandon's presentation at the beginning, the importance of that community level dialogue is vital in order to move the peace process forward. So to recognise that work that women are involved in is particularly important. So the project that this article really came from really had two aims. And firstly, it was to recognise the rich and diverse experience and expertise and skills held by women who use or have used mediation in their peace building work from across the island of Ireland. And this includes women from the north of Ireland, but also from the south, and also women who have come from other parts of the world, who now live on the island of Ireland and may have come from conflict contexts and have experience in this area from their own home country, and that we often don't actually know about. And so we ran 4 focus groups. One was in Belfast, one in London Derry, one in Dublin, and one in Dundalk. We thought it was particularly important to bring into the dialogue women from border counties. So that was why we included a focus group in Dundalk. And the project, so within these focus groups, it was populated by a diversity of women, those who are working in peace mediation on this island, but also those who had experience or both domestic and international experience in using mediation and peace building throughout the world. The second aim of the project was to put in motion the possibility of building a network of women mediators and peace builders across the island of Ireland in order to develop ideas of what this could look like and how women would like to conceptualize it in a sense. So in the short time I have left, I might just say something about the findings from the focus group. So firstly, in the Northern Ireland context, participants in the focus groups exhibited inevitably a wide range of expertise. Some participants had worked directly in prisons during and after the Troubles. Others worked in arts projects designed to bring different communities together. So we really had this broad kind of definition of what we mean by mediation, using different tools and different skills. We spoke to women who had really started mediation experience as a child when she'd accompanied her mother to peacebuilding meetings. Others had extensive mediation working between armed groups in multiple ways. And these women, have been obviously, as we know, involved in every facet and stage of peace building in Northern Ireland. Now, I know that this event is particularly focused on legacies of violence in the context of Northern Ireland, but I think it's also important to recognise that in addition to women's expertise in mediation and peace building conducted on this island, there's also women, as I mentioned before, who have experience in peace building and mediative practice, who come from other conflict contexts and now live on the island, but have had less opportunity for their experiences to be recognised, and particularly those who have come to the island as refugees. So I provide one example of one of the women who was in the focus group in Dundalk. She had been heavily involved in mediating between families on issues of child trafficking whilst living in a refugee camp in Tanzania. And she noted that really in the 10 years that she'd lived in this country, this had never been recognised. And it's the really important experience that could be drawn upon in other contexts. So the argument we make in this article is that this narrow definition of peace mediation and its sort of general association with high-level track one negotiations contributes to overshadowing the realities of women's diverse and extensive experience in mediation practice, much of it which is located at the grassroots level. So this we found to be consistent in the focus groups. So in the article, we look at issues relating to perspectives of a kind of lack of self-recognition as a mediator amongst women in the groups, and also a lack of external recognition. So many women discussed in the focus groups how they would regularly use what we would call mediative practice, but they wouldn't call themselves a mediator. So one participant who was initially reluctant to call herself a mediator, for example, she had described talked about extensively her experiences of working with members of the Orange Order in order to kind of help soften positions and change outlook somewhat. And when it was identified in the discussion that this really was a form of mediation, it made her rethink, in a sense, and really value her work more. And this was the case, I suppose, with other participants. Well, they had not necessarily thought of themselves as mediators within that term. Kind of discussing it kind of made them kind of change that self-perception somewhat. And I think that this pattern, has clear connections to the way in which mediation is defined internationally. So when women are kind of conditioned in somewhat to believe that the only real or serious mediation is at track one or high level, then they become uncomfortable identifying their own work as mediative practice. But more prevalent, I suppose, in the discussions was that women felt they had very little external recognition for their work as mediators at the community level. And as a result, the work that women do is often unpaid, and it's often not recognised. It's defined in terms of community development, and they felt that wasn't valued in the same way as being termed as a mediator. So because this work often really doesn't fall under this kind of umbrella term of mediation, women's work at grassroots level is often constructed as separate from kind of this real, what we term as real mediation. So women explained how they often had their experiences undermined and referred to by some as something of a kind of a hobby rather than an invaluable professional experience or expertise. And I suppose just to sort of sum up, these kind of essentialized understandings of women's location in the community, that in a sense they are by nature more peaceful, leads to this, the perpetuation of ideas that this is just something that women do. And these processes therefore are seen and not in professional terms. And as I mentioned before, that they're often unpaid and women tend to be overworked and not recognized for their professional skills. And so just to sum up kind of more completely, I suppose, is that we argue that in part this lack of self-perception of being a mediator, or the lack of external recognition of women's mediation experience, is also an issue of terminology. So the way that the term mediator or peace mediator is used or interpreted can be restrictive with regard to recognizing women's expertise. where the figures on women in mediation are low, they are only referring to a certain sector of the population that are working on mediation. And of course, while those figures on high-level negotiations are completely unacceptable in themselves, if we only include high-level negotiations in the figures, it has the effect of failing to recognise the expertise of women who use mediative practice, if we call it that, in other areas. And in turn, this lack of recognition, I would argue, contributes to the kind of perpetuation of these very poor figures in high-level negotiations due to the understanding that women are often excluded from talks due to a perception that they don't have enough experience or they don't hold the correct credentials. And so just to finish up, I should just note that as part of the project, that we produced another report, which identifies, I suppose, particularly some of the challenges, more precisely some of the challenges that women face working in peace building and using mediative practice. We also identified particularly some of the tools that they use and why, and look at some of the reasons why women should be part of any negotiations. There's also a short film that we made as part of the project, which was, I suppose, as a way of kind of making the research more accessible. So I can certainly share the link to the film, and I'm not sure if anybody who participated in the film is here today, but it's really built around the voices of women who participated and have that extensive experience. And so it's really fabulous to hear their stories. And this film is called Women's Voices, Building Networks, Voices of Women in Peace Mediation on the Island of Ireland. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more in the Q&A about the report or any other parts of the project. But for now, I think I'm probably out of time, so I'll leave it there.
That's great. Thank you very much, Dr. Heidi Riley. And I'd just like to say your paper, it was a really fascinating read. And I found really interesting this parallel that you draw between the essentialism or the essentialization of women as naturally peaceful, that kind of removes all of the sense of agency, of effort and of work that women do put in to their mediation work. And that leads to the devaluation of all of the work that women do within the peace process. And I think it's a really interesting link, and you kind of have to go think down through different layers of how does that actually happen and how does that actually work? If we're essentially good at something, then surely we should be at the top level of it. But of course, it's not recognizing the full humanity of women when we do that. So I will stop talking and bring us back to the experts once more. So now we're going to have a little panel discussion and question and answers session. I'm going to invite all of our authors to turn back on their cameras. I'm also going to invite Michelle Kearns. So Michelle Kearns is the current researcher working on the Legacy of Violence program at Glencree. Michelle has been reading your questions, and she will now be able to share some of those with us with the panel. We should be able to, so in the top right corner of your all of your screens as participants, you can switch the view. If you click on the view button, you can switch to gallery view, and you'll be able to see our speakers as they come up on screen. So I'm going to hand over now to Michelle to ask our first question to the panelists.
Thank you very much, Roberta. So just a reminder of the panelists that we have with us here today. We have Jo Robinson, we have Ashle Bailey-Gilreath, Heidi Riley, and Geoffrey Corry as well. Geoffrey, I don't know if you want to turn your camera on there as well for this part of the discussion.
Okay, I've been blocked, but I'll try it again now.
I think you're covered.
There we go.
Great.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
So thank you all so much. The questions have been flying in here, so we'll try and get to as many of these as possible. And just a reminder as well that you can upvote questions too. so that if there's a question that you really want to see answered, you can vote for this, and we'll make sure that we get to that during the discussion. So we have a few different ones here. I see there's one from Jan that asks about working in conflict resolution. Do we learn enough from where diverse communities live together and seem to have addressed conflicts effectively and resolved conflict or potential conflict? And says that there must be good examples out there in our wonderful world. So for the panelists, I guess this is a question for you. Is there other examples of places where we can learn from, or are you aware of some maybe some contexts that have, been able to effectively demonstrate kind of resolving their differences and being able to move towards greater reconciliation?
Well, I'll kick off.
Great, Geoffrey.
I think the big challenge for practitioners on the ground is, well, just speaking for myself, you're so busy actually engaged in the work, and often it's underfunded, and you don't have the resources for writing up or monitoring the work as you go along. And secondly, you're very much following your nose. You don't know where the next step is going to be. So it's only really since I've come out of the work or been so practically involved that I've had time to think and reflect and to try to write up these experiences. But it is a real challenge. How do we get the case examples written up? So there's a piece of work for all those students in university. Why don't you join us down in the grassroots and come and write up our experiences as we go along, but protecting confidentiality at the same time.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey. And one of the things that I would be interested in knowing, just given your really, really interesting presentation there, Heidi, is if there are any examples that we could maybe learn from where women's role in, in peace mediation and recognition of women's role in this process has been maybe done more effectively, and could provide maybe a model that we could draw from.
Thank you very much for the question, and also the question from the panelist. And I just want to kind of, first of all, add to Geoffrey's comment about the difficulty of being able to kind of document different cases and the time constraints and the funding constraints and whatever. I think that's absolutely right. But I think there is scope to be working more collaboratively between academia and practice, and that is a real, positive way of moving forward. And I think even though we're not there yet, there are some kind of funding initiatives, and certainly the funding that I got for this project, which was built around collaboration with civil society organisations as an academic, and I think this is to be welcomed. In terms of looking at other contexts and women in peace mediation, I think there is a beginning to be a lot more advocacy around this area about recognising women's work at different, I don't know if I should say levels, but in different mediation spaces. I think we say levels, we start talking about this hierarchy, which is a little bit worrying. But certainly there now exists a number of regional networks on women mediators. So there is, the first one was the Nordic network of women mediators, which was established in 2015. We now have the Mediterranean network. There is now FemWise Africa, which is another network which is run out of the African Union. And women mediators across the Commonwealth is also a fairly new one, which I've actually just been working on a consultancy with. And as part of that consultancy, as a research consultancy, we've been looking specifically at women's experiences at the grassroots level, and in looking at some of the enabling factors that women have that in their experiences have enabled them to kind of gain them better recognition. But it's also getting this balance of advocating for women, for recognition of women's participation in community level mediation, balancing that with risk as well, because we have to remember that there is often, particularly young women, women of all ages, I suppose, that there is a level of risk that goes with the work that they carry out. And actually their risk they're more prone to risk because they are at the community level than those that tend to be protected by security in high level negotiations. But I think there certainly is a lot of more research coming out around grassroots mediation. Now, if I look at, I've done a lot of work recently in Nepal, and the role that women play at the community level is absolutely huge in terms of transforming from a transformation of a conflict environment. So, you know, there are examples from all across the world. So if the participant, I can certainly give some suggestions of some research maybe that might be of use.
Hey, thank you so much, Heidi. And then just in the spirit of learning from others as well, I know, Ashley, in your paper, you highlighted many, different contexts where socially engaged photography has been used, really, really effectively, and then was able to, discuss how this would be a good model for use in Northern Ireland as well. So I don't know if you want to maybe elaborate on that a little bit and how that can feed into the reconciliation process.
Yeah, so in my paper, I highlight two artists, and one focused on the Turkish conflict, and the other focuses on homelessness, actually, in the UK, and ways to integrate those things and highlight those things. There's also a really great, it's not included in my paper, but a really great organization called Photo Voice, and they have sort of operationalized a really wonderful method for using photography. So they work a lot with NGOs, but they've done an excellent job of utilizing sort of socially engaged photographic practice with on the ground participants throughout the world, and most of the time these are conflict related zones. So Photo Voice is a really good point of reference for how that's been done successfully.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. Maybe move on to one of the other questions now. So there's been quite a few points coming in regarding legacy, and then also how this maybe ties into Brexit and the centenary year that we are in now as well. So I think Angela Mulholland had a question there. I think that that we can maybe answer, that asks, first of all, what is the definition of legacy within the Northern Irish context? And then if this is an ongoing process, and if so, when does it start? And when does it end, if ever? So I think that's maybe the first part of the question, kind of understanding, kind of what we are actually discussing when we talk about legacy. And then maybe it would be great if we could touch on how we can address the consequences of Brexit and the Northern Irish centenary within the overall legacy of conflict in Northern Ireland. So I would be really interested to hear your thoughts on that as well. Maybe Joe, we can come to you first if you have any thoughts on that.
What is legacy? I don't know the answer to that. It seems like it's one of those things that would be somewhat defined a bit slipperily, if that's a word. It's not. I made it up. Yeah, I don't know. As far as Brexit and centenaries, there was, I think, one of the centenary of the Rising was done. It was fairly interesting to look at, because I was living in Dublin at the time. It was fairly interesting to look at how the different ways in which that was performed down there. There was a lot of I remember Jerry Kearns, geographer at Maynooth, gave a paper where he looked at the different ways in which the different kind of master narratives of 25 years, 50 years, 75 years, 100 years. And his conclusion was that in the 2016 one, there was no real master narrative. It was all kind of split apart down south. There was these performances, these public performances that were really transgressive and really risk-taking, and at the same time, they were just kind of sort of the same old, things we've come to expect. It was also kind of really, in some ways down south, it was really militarized. Like there was this thing where like a Irish soldier came, and do you remember this story where the Irish soldiers went into schools and gave kids tricolors, and there was one quote, this 9-year-old kid was like, and then what do you think of that? And he said something like, up the raw. Like, so, yeah, so I think just in a sense that the way, I mean, Brexit is going to be a problem. It already is a problem. It's definitely pushing us further and further collectively away from internal self evaluation, I think. And also in terms of our collective memory practices. So yeah, I don't have a lot more to say on that. Okay. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Joe. Jeffrey, I think you were going to come in there.
For me, there's about 3 or 4 aspects to legacy, and particularly in the Irish situation, the legacy of violence. It's the impact of the violence on this generation or on future generations. And there's no doubt that we have to work through that impact, the social, the psychological, the emotional, the historical, the political impact. So we have to learn the lessons of the past. And we have a huge burden of history here that goes back generations. And what we've learned is that if we do not transform, if we do not work with the hurt and the pain of those who have been impacted by the violence, well, it just gets carried on into the next generation and keeps going. And we know in something as big as the genocide in Turkey, they're now into the 5th or 6th generation, where still that genocide has not against the Turkish, the Kurdish community, that still hasn't been processed. So young people or their grandchildren want to know the truth about what happened, and if the truth does not come out, it carries on in the being of people. And in that sense, legacy is how we learn from it, we unpack it, and make meaning out of the conflict that it generated.
Okay, very good points. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. And I'm sure it's going to be a lot of challenges around this. I think it's a point that there's been quite a few questions on. Maybe staying just on the topic of legacy a little bit, there has been a couple of questions and points as well. So we've one from Sean Farron and also Laura Coulter. That maybe highlights that there is a little bit of a lack of engagement or leadership from political parties in addressing the issue of legacy, and a suggestion that there should be scope for maybe civic society groups or even a greater initiative from civic society groups to lead in this area. So to come together and design and implement a legacy process. So I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts on that, and maybe how civic society actors or groups could come together to maybe fill a little bit of a gap that there's a feeling that has been left by political parties.
I don't think that the problem is that there hasn't been initiatives or there hasn't been work by civil society groups. There certainly has. There's the healing through remembering, there's ethical and shared remembering, there's all sorts of other kinds of different proposals that have been looked at, and approaches and methodologies that have been pioneered by civil society groups in Northern Ireland. That's not towards legacy issues. The problem is not the lack of effort. I think Brandon said something like this in his introduction. The problem is lack of will, right? The problem is the fact that the Northern Irish political establishment is sort of institutionally set up to prevent it. It's a consociational system that depends for its very survival on kind of ethno-sectarianism. So within that context, like I think you're often pitching these appeals like, oh, why isn't there something? There is something. The problem is how that something translates into policy.
Okay, thank you, Joe. And I think that's a really good point you raise at the end. So how do we translate this work, into policy, and maybe how do we give a greater platform to the work that is being already done by those civic society groups? Wondering if any of our other panelists have any thoughts on this.
Well, I'll chip in again. There's no doubt we are at yet another impasse in resolving the Stormont House Agreement. And it's unfortunate that the two governments haven't been able to work together for obvious, difficult, present polarized issues. And so the trouble is, who is mediating this present impasse? Northern Ireland Office has done a fair degree of consultation and is trying to do that at the moment. But who's going to come forward to broker something that suits the churches? Could be in a position to do that, and maybe there is some movement there. The church leaders more recently are pulling together a bit better. Do they have enough energy? Do they have enough ability to talk and engage the politicians? Let's hope that they do try. But the years are going by, and the relevancy of the Stormont House Agreement initiatives may have to be remodeled or regrouped. There's still truth has still to be told. So there has to be a truth recovery unit. The need to engage, but we need, as I said earlier, some form of limited immunity. So unless we create some instrument like limited immunity, both loyalist and Republican paramilitaries are not going to come forward to reveal the incidents. And of course, people are dying, and maybe that's part of the upper level strategy. If you kick this can down the road much further, there won't be a need from their point of view of being able to do that. But unfortunately, there was a dirty war. There were many other things going on, and nobody wants to, unless there's some safeguards, legal safeguards put in, nobody is going to come forward to talk about those things.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey. So again, highlighting, I think, some really different or really important points and some of the difficulties that are involved in this process too. Just trying to have a look at some of the rest of the questions here, lots of different ones to go through. I think that there are, there's one specific question, I think there that's aimed at Joe. I'm wondering if you want to maybe answer that one. I'm curious to know if individuals in conflict are sometimes better able to influence the system and culture if they have moved on to a more manageable level of emotion, and if there's different levels of moving on. And then I think that there's one other question as well, if you wanted to touch on kind of relating to that as well. And that's looking at the temporality of victims. So question from Dara, probably I think throwing a couple of different things at you here, so apologies. But so Dara shares the skepticism of reconciliation being used to block questioning of deeper processes and or exploration of violence. So Dara wanted to know is how to give visibility and respect to resistant victims without reproducing an ethos of violence. So I'm wondering if you might be able to maybe touch on those couple of points.
I think that those questions go together pretty well because, so I guess at first I'd say that in this particular paper that I've done there's no individuals there. I'm concerned with sort of social and political processes. So, you know, that's why, I mean, I think we can all, when I say like temporal hierarchy of victims, I was, you know, I had people in my head who would be at the top of that hierarchy. And part of the problem is that but I would never like have a go at how people grieve or how they move on or do anything like that, because that's ultimately, that comes down to a whole host of factors that I am not and could never be privy to, you know. And in my work, I've tried to very much outline different ways in which this works. But what I'd say is the problem, again, scaling it back up to a social level, is the first questioner asks, can individuals move better affect social policy and whatnot if they're able to move on? The answer to that is yes, but the problem with that is that they also reify or recreate or reestablish, you know, the same sort of social processes that privilege the individual process they've gone through over people who haven't gone through that process, or who don't want to go through that process, or who refuse to go through that process. So that's where that leads into the second question. I don't think that rebellious mourning, as I name it, has to reify violence producing frames. I think there's a whole host of ways in which our grief in public space, mourning in public space manifests. One of the ways in which, you know, a failure to move on is not tantamount to rejustification of violence. And obviously there would need to be, you know, some kind of nuance there. But I think that there is a lot of nuance there. Does that make sense?
I think that's great. Thank you so much, Joe. And then I think we had one other specific question that was aimed at Ashley, and that was if you can name some associations or communities that practice collaborative art in Northern Ireland as part of the reconciliation process between Catholics and Protestants. So just if you're aware of maybe any ongoing initiatives within Northern Ireland that maybe engage with this type of process.
Yeah, there's quite a few. I guess the ones I would highlight, Wave Trauma actually did a really wonderful last year. It was one thing with sort of socially engaged or collaborative art practices, especially around the ideas of trauma or conflict, is that they're usually relatively long-term projects. So it's not sort of a one in and one out workshop. But Wave recently completed I think it was about 6 to 8 months, and it was a collaborative art project. They had individuals who were being treated at Wave who were sort of in a very unique, although unfortunately not as unique as it should be, position of not being able to find their voice and to identify the trauma that they were grappling with, but they were struggling with sort of psychological or physical symptoms from having to experience that or having a family member experience that. So Wave did a really wonderful, there's actually a documentary that was produced by I am blanking on the production company. I can try to find it, and then if there's sort of show notes or anything, you can link it in there. I can link to the actual documentary. But they provided individuals with the opportunity to choose the sort of art form that they wanted to pursue. And they had artists that worked there with them. And so they did sculpting, painting. There was a photographer who's done a lot of community photography work throughout Belfast. And the documentary really highlights sort of that process and how wonderful that was for them. And then also Belfast Exposed, which is a photography gallery in Belfast, but they've done a lot of work throughout Northern Ireland. They've worked with younger people, cross community work, thing like that. And so Belfast Exposed has done a really great job. They originally got started as a community photography group before sort of establishing themselves as a nonprofit. So those would be the two I would highlight. There's tons. I'm sure Heidi's probably come across some individuals and mediators who worked within art that she highlighted in her talk. So she may know some others who are more sort of individuals who are working with those things.
Thank you, Ashley. I think you mentioned some really interesting examples there, and hopefully some of those exhibitions we might get a chance to go and see once some of these restrictions around COVID lifts. Heidi, I'm wondering if you want to maybe jump in there and have any other examples you could mention.
Yeah. Thanks so much, and Ashley, thanks for your detail of the two that you detailed there. Yes, we did actually work with some individuals and focus groups that were working in various art projects using the various different forms of art in the process. So we had people who were part of Theatre of Witness, which I think is such an important medium. Theatre as a medium for storytelling is so important. So we had a few people who were part of various Theatre of Witness projects. Also, maybe I should mention some of the art projects that Stick Little Fingers are working on in Newry, who may be less well known, but they are working more with children and using art as a method of bringing children together across a variety of different divides. And their work was so interesting. It's been carrying on right through since the 90s up until the present day. Other things, I suppose, is a lot of people probably know about Conflict Textiles, which isn't specifically focused on Northern Ireland, but there's an excellent online exhibition at the moment, which is I think it's been run out of Ulster University. I'm sure a lot of people already know about it, but using textiles to depict images of the past. In Northern Ireland and in other contexts. I think that's particularly important. And we also looked at people who use visualization as a form of mediation. So Stephanie Heckman, who did the visuals for our film, she uses images in order to facilitate dialogue between different individuals, and it's a way of kind of documenting narratives in a kind of simplistic way, and which I think has a longer term impact as well. People can kind of relate to those images, so that was really important. So anyway, just to say, I think investment in the arts as a form of conflict resolution or conflict transformation, shall I say, is particularly important. So I'll maybe just leave it there.
Thank you, Heidi. I think we had one more question there from Peter Sheridan that questions the capacity of the criminal justice system in the way it currently is to be able to deal with the legacy of conflict. So Peter has expanded a little bit on the question there, just on this issue, and gives some example that as part of the Good Friday Agreement, some prisoners have been there have been limited sentences for a maximum of 2 years. And just a couple of other examples there. So I'll maybe let the panelists have a look at that question in more detail there. But just to kind of frame it more generally, I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on the capacity of the criminal justice system, and if you think that it does have the capacity to deal with the legacy of violence in its current structure.
Well, I think one of the drawbacks of there not being a high level truth and reconciliation type architecture was that people had to fall back on the traditional criminal justice system to process their cases, and we've seen that that's where it's all been fought out in the courts, particularly in Belfast, and some of those have been very successful, but it's high cost because lawyers they're the ones who are gaining often from good job for them, but the lack of proceeding with some kind of Stormont House agreement and implementing it has meant that we don't have a community-based possibilities where this needs to happen. Now there is also, of course, are people ready for it? We experienced, I think, in the immediate, say, 10 years after Good Friday Agreement, it was the Catholic nationalist community who came forward and the British victims who came forward to engage. There was a kind of a second wave for us when we did acknowledgement circles working with former RUC and former UBR families, and that helped tremendously. So there is a need for some cases like that we have tried to create, and the challenge is can the Stormont House Agreement adapt itself, or if that's not going to happen, will British government provide some funding for alternative forms, community-based fora to get off the ground.
Okay, thank you so much, Geoffrey. Welcome back to Professor Brandon Hamber as well, who has been able to rejoin us. It's great to have you back. We just had a question from one of the audience members there, questioning the capacity of the criminal justice system to be able to deal with the legacy of violence. I'm wondering, Brandon, if you have maybe any inputs that you would like to share on this topic.
Well, thank you, and my apologies. I had to step away for a while, so I'm sure I have missed a lot, but I hope what I say others haven't already said. Is the picture in that okay?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, my response would be very similar to the previous response. The fact that this is being picked up within the mainstream criminal justice system through a range of different processes is, in a sense, part of the problem. This is not to say that if you had I don't know if you'd call it, it would be an independent body from those structures, that it wouldn't cost a lot of money. But I think it's, the logic of it would be that you wouldn't be burdening the current system with it by having a sort of macro system sitting on another system sitting on the side. So I would just really concur with the previous comment. I mean, right back to Chief Constable Hugh Ord, that was his view that current policing should not be managing this type of a process, if I'm not mistaken. And so, I would just concur with the previous point. I think the previous speaker also raised the issue of timing. I know that wasn't part of the question. I guess for me, the challenge is, when I first came here in 96 and in 98, people said, well, the timing's not right for dealing with the past process because it's too close to the peace process. And now 20 years later, people are saying the timing's not right because it's too far away, or we've got other challenges like Brexit on the table. So I don't know if the timing is ever right. For me, it's a question of political leadership. It's not actually a question of timing. What we know on the time question is it's not going away. So I think it's a leadership question, not a timing question.
Can I offer a couple comments, Michelle? Yeah. So I'd say that, yes, the question is right. Transitional legalism generally is deeply ill-equipped to deal with historical crimes. And there's two reasons, I think largely two reasons for that. The first is that legal systems tend to individualize perpetration. Like there's a clear individual perpetrator, and as such, it's very difficult to get at notions of collective responsibility or institutional responsibility or state responsibility, right? The other one is going back to my theme of temporality. It's singularly ill-equipped to deal with crimes that don't have a clear temporal boundary, that didn't occur within a set period of time. So when injustices or wrongdoings have a long sort of historical roots or historical background, the criminal justice procedure is going to focus only on the occurrence of a singular individual crime, and as such, it just simply can't get at sort of longue durée processes. There's in my paper, if you read it, I use a lot of the work by a Colombian sociologist named Alejandro Castillo Cuellar, and he argues very well. I think he's looking at the South African and the Colombian process together, and he's arguing that we basically arguing what I just said, and then he's saying that in that context of transitional legalism, structural inability to deal with historical crimes, that's where reconciliation comes in as kind of a way to try to square the circle between what the sorts of justice that can be achieved. It's like basically, oh, you can't have formal justice, so we'll offer you this sort of process instead. So it becomes kind of a mechanism to try to end justice-seeking processes and confine them to a particular time. And so we can now okay, so it's done now, we can move forward.
Okay, thank you, Joe. We had another couple of questions in here from Phelim, and Phelim mentions how there are many legacies of conflict in Ireland, and one of these was partition. And rather than solving the conflict on the island, it reinforced that conflict, and led to segregated living patterns and segregated education. And Phelim highlights that all of these need to be addressed in a comprehensive analysis of what prevent movement towards peace or mutual respect and equality. So I'm wondering if any of our panelists maybe want to comment on that a little bit and maybe discuss how we can maybe solve some of those issues and move towards equality and reconciliation, as he mentions.
Is Brandon going to have a go at handling that? No. I think we need to honor, going back to the 1920s, we didn't have centers for dispute resolution or centers for mediation or masters in all this work. So partition, could be seen as a very creative British political concept that got managed. It's a conflict management approach. So it managed the moment, but the trouble is when you manage something as structural as partition, it was meant to be temporary, but it has kept going and going because there hasn't been high-level political solutions, apart from obviously all the build-up, the political work that grew up and the building blocks of peace that got into the Good Friday Agreement, which is the basis for going forward. But it does require the close cooperation between the two governments. And if we don't have that, as well as intercommunal support, then there are difficulties. Obviously, Brexit has had a huge polarizing effect, bringing back partition in a new way. But the only way, but it's a political issue, and it behoves us to create a political process whereby the main players, in academic world, they're called actors. I like to see them as players on the field, and as a way of being able to, again, if there is one learning from our peace process is that when you hit a blockage, an impasse, you pile in extra political resources. You don't give up or don't go under it, but you actually redouble your efforts to create the space by which, either through the back channels and then through the front channels, you find ways through this. And well, maybe that's what's happening as we speak.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. I know that Porrick Yates had submitted a question, and he had shared as well some of the work that he is doing with the Truth Recovery Process Group. So I know he had a question for panelists to ask if you were familiar with this work, and if anyone who has maybe read about it thinks of the idea. But then maybe just, if you're not able to comment on that, maybe more generally, if you have any thoughts on the Truth Recovery process, and maybe some implications around that, and maybe where more progress might be needed or how this could be achieved. I'm not sure if maybe Heidi, if you have any thoughts on this, or if anybody else wants to jump in.
Thank you, Michelle. I have to say, I'm not an expert on the truth recovery process, but I suppose I can just talk a little bit more generally around this issue. I mean, I suppose without these mechanisms in place, this issue we were talking about before around intergenerational trauma and the continuation of intergenerational trauma is hugely problematic, and we see it across all areas of the world, without some form of proper established truth telling over a long period of time, then these issues are not going to be properly addressed. And I think there are innovative ways in which that can be done, but it involves civil society to be able to actually form a diversity of civil society to be included in the talks that actually lead to that kind of process. Because the problem is that if we implement or something that may have worked in one context or worked to a certain extent, it's not going to necessarily be appropriate for this island. So I think what's particularly important is that anything that is established or that is going to come to fruition has to have the stamp of a diversity of civil society voices, taking into account not only those individuals that remember the troubles within their lifetime, but actually looking at the youth as well, and also newer communities as well coming in, because they're all part of this new, the present day, what it's and what that will mean going forward into the future.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Just for our other panelists, I'm wondering if anybody is familiar with the Truth Recovery Process Group that Porrick has highlighted.
I can jump in here if you want.
Great, Brandon, thank you.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with their work, so I look forward to having a look at that. I think, the discussion about should there be a truth recovery process is an incredibly challenging and difficult one, and one we're probably not going to resolve here. But I mean, broadly speaking, for me, there's sort of always two components, and the one is the societal, social, community, civil component of truth recovery, which is about understanding and recognition and acknowledgement and those type of issues. And then there's the technical side of truth recovery, and we do have options on the table in terms of information retrieval that were made within the Stormont House Agreement, technical mechanisms that might get to certain answers for families. And so I think there's a gap between the technical and the more social. If I think about the social side of that process, if you looked at something like the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission mandate, or you looked at the Sierra Leone Truth Commission, they both use this phrase, which is that the truth recovery process was about the causes, the nature, and the extent of the conflict. And I think what's challenging in the context of Northern Ireland is that in South Africa, for example, before it started, we broadly knew the causes. It was racialized apartheid. It was a crime against humanity. It had been well established. So it was really an inquiry into the nature and the extent of that conflict. Whereas in the situation here, actually, you have brilliant data on the nature and extent of the conflict. I mean, through the Kane project at Ulster University, they've GPS'd all the deaths, So, the Marie Smith's work on the cost of the Troubles, many other people have documented the nature and extent of the conflict. The debate is about the causes of the conflict. And that's a much more difficult nut to crack. But by not engaging in that as a public discussion, what has happened is it's just sort of retreated back into the trenches, and people have, become hardened in their narratives, hardened in their discussion about the causes, and that's made the process more and more unstable rather than stable. So I don't know exactly how we do that discussion on the causes, but it feels to me, having now been here for, a quarter of a century, that this is the missing piece, is that social discussion about those issues. And we can work on the technical side of the truth recovery, but it's the social problem, the civil problem that's looming large now.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Joe, did you want to add something there?
Just, I totally agree with everything Brandon just said. But I would also, sort of a caution of truth recovery is always this question of, whose truth is getting recovered. And just because there's an officially sanctioned truth recovery process, we still have to look at the ways in which the whole foundation of that architecture is put in place. And just as a kind of a cautionary one, we don't have to look very far away to see what's kind of been happening with the report on the Mother and Baby Homes, the report of the Mother and Baby Homes Commission down in the Republic of Ireland, where they put all this architecture in place and whatnot, and survivors still very much feel, many survivors still very much feel betrayed by that process. So again, there's a sense in which, truth recovery is grand and great, but we can't ever close our eyes to the sort of the relationships of power that go into forming any sort of process.
I just to say, Bordwick, I've forgotten to read your paper, and now that you've brought it to our attention, I'll have a go at reading it. I think we need to explore why people need the truth. And if they feel blocked from getting the truth, then that only means that they have to keep their fight going and to remember their loved ones. And so the fact that there hasn't been some open truth recovery process for victims, and indeed for others as well, means that they get stuck and they can't move on when society wants them to move on. Until they feel they get justice, then they're stuck. But there's also, I have a diagram in my journal, in the journal article, which also highlights the moral obstacle, or the moral anchor point, that when that what has been done to them is immoral, and their story hasn't been heard or acknowledged about the immorality of the violence, and that may of course have deep political issues there. In terms of truth recovery, it's unfortunate that legal efforts will obviously be very adversarial. And the British Ministry of Defence will want to protect all what has been done in the past. One bright spot has been in the Canova Commission, headed by former Chief Constable Boucher. He seems to have found a way through informal or whatever channels to be able to get truth for victims. And somebody said to me recently that the British Ministry of Defence may be more open to this informal type of approach. For Southern victims, they've obviously found huge obstacles when they go to the Gardaí. So it's also an onus on the Southern government to find and set up some truth recovery process, which can help Southern victims of the violence to get to recover the truth, because without recovering the truth, they cannot move on.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey. And to all of our panelists today, I think for a really, really rich discussion and covering so many themes. And I think the discussion we've had here today really reflects, the work that is in the journal as well. So many different actors and stakeholders, different topics. I mean, going from, the role of the church to language, the criminal justice system, and of course, legacy that is so crucial in this year and in the coming months as well. So I just wanted to say a massive thank you to all of our panelists here today. And I don't know if any of you want to add maybe any kind of take-home remarks or learnings you've had from today. You're very welcome to do that before we move on to our closing remarks. You're all okay? All right. Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so Roberta.
Thanks, Michelle. Great, and thanks to all our panelists. That was really fascinating. I'm just going to introduce Roisin McGlone, and we're going to welcome her to make some closing remarks today. Roisin is the program manager of the Legacy of Violence program at Glencree. Roisin was born in Belfast, and she's been involved in conflict transformation in Northern Ireland and internationally for many years. In Northern Ireland, but also in places like Croatia, Macedonia, Guyana, America, South Africa. She was one of 2 community relations nominees on the Civic Forum. She was an assistant boundary commissioner for Belfast, an independent member of the Northern Ireland Policing Board, and a board member of the Northern Ireland Community Relations Council. She will close our webinar today and give some insights into the Legacy of Violence program at Glencree. Welcome, Roisin. Just to get the mute off there again.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Welcome. Thanks, Roberta. Thanks for those kind comments, and thanks to everybody that's contributed to this. This has been a superb debate. And I suppose I don't want to keep you all too long. Roberta introduced me there like a rock star, but I feel a bit like the drummer at the end of the concert. But I suppose there was a number of things struck me from today's discussion. And one of the things that was very simple that struck me was Brandon mentioned Dalai Lama, and he talked about the answer to the question of we're tired. Is that we just have to continue. And I suppose the question is out there. There's 2 questions really. Why this journal? And why do we need to continue doing the work that we do? And I'm going to answer the first question with a short story, who some of the people might recognise. I mean, besides the fact that academia needs peer-reviewed journals, I want to tell you a story about 20 years ago when I was working on the interfaces in West Belfast, and we were dealing with issues like policing and parades and violence, and we were working with ex-prisoners. We all recognised in the community that this was just after the Good Friday Agreement, and very often, you know, in conflicts, that's when it's after the agreement things get worse. So I engaged an anthropologist as our researcher, and as part of looking for funding, we applied to a donor for a research grant to produce some documentation. And I remember they came back to us and they said, sorry, you can't have that grant because you don't have enough critical distance. You're too close to the issues. So this journal today proves that in that 20 years, we have come through that journey, and that's the thing I'm most proud of in it today. So thank you to all of the authors for having the critical distance and being close to the issues. So that's why the journal. In terms of the work, I was struck during the discussions today that there are really 2 peace processes. There's the political process, and that evolved after the Good Friday Agreement. And I don't want to minimise the fantastic achievement of the Good Friday Agreement, but it was just an agreement. It was no more than that. And then there was the peace process to implement that agreement. And in some senses, there's a lot of issues have been identified this morning about what the problems are. You know, Barbara mentioned the fact that this project, for most of its life, actually worked in a vacuum, a political vacuum in the north, because the assembly stormont was suspended. Rory mentioned the lost lives, and Brandon mentioned the reactive politics, and also a phrase which frightened me a bit, which was really about taking the peace process for granted. But in some senses, that really is what appears to have been happening recently. And in a way, the political process is our context, because we have the difficult issues of Brexit. We have calls for a border poll. We have, this is the centenary of the formation of the state. And I suppose why does this matter? Matters because of the lost lives. And the terminology that was used by people today, I actually found excellent in a sense, because it really brings us to what it is we need to be addressing. The phrase post-traumatic life, the collective grief, the emotional trauma, and Joe talked about reconciliation being to restore or to bring together. And in many senses, that's the work that's been happening with the grassroots peace process. One of the disadvantages of Zoom, there are lots of advantages and lots of disadvantages, but one of the disadvantages is we don't get the side passionate discussions around some of these issues. And Derek, we didn't get to your issue around civic society and the role for civic society, but rest assured that these discussions today have stimulated a lot of thoughts in my head about what we can do in our final year of this project. We also have to look at the grassroots level, the disproportionate impact that the troubles, as we euphemistically call them, have caused. And the one statement from Brandon that I found quite stark was the fact that he said that South Africa were confronted by the harm that had been done. And what I would say is that I'd like to make two final comments, one on women's representation and one on the work that we're doing at the moment. Heidi, you're absolutely right that women are disproportionately engaged in high level, not engaged in or not represented in high level peace negotiations. But I can tell you from working on the ground, there is a democratization of work on the ground. Like when I first started the mobile phone network, it was mainly women. When we did some peaceful protests around parades, it was women that were involved in that. So there are women out there at the forefront of the conflict mediation. When it comes to representation at perhaps meetings at a government level, that does change, but the women are out there doing the work. And just then, as a final comment, we have been very privileged in this project to walk a journey with the people who have been most harmed, and we will continue to do it. And Glencree has been involved in it for years, but this particular journey we've been on with a number of the groups, and it is astounding to hear people relay stories. And when you say to them, when did that happen? And they say 1971. And it's as if it was yesterday, and we are still confronted by that harm, because, to use a word that Brandon used, it's shameful that we haven't found a way to look at, or found an agreement, not a way. We find many, many ways to look at truth recovery, but we haven't had any agreement on that. And I think the political process, if it is to do anything, if it can do that and that alone, that would be enough. And I just want to remind people as well that this new decade, new approach, and they're now calling it the NDNA. It's very interesting that the acronym actually has DNA in it, because we're starting to come to the place where it's in our DNA not to solve problems, but to create them. So I suppose I just like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for your wonderful contributions. I was looking and there was a lot of chatter going on there. We really do miss the person to person. And we hope before the end of this project that we will be able to capitalise and certainly move on to look at what civic society can do and be a party to that from Glencree and from the Legacy of Violence project at Glencree. So it's down to me now, and Roberta, you can probably finish off. But yes, thank you very much for all of your contributions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Roisin. And just finally, I'd like to thank our speakers today, the backroom team as well, who've been keeping everything running, all of the authors and the editors of the journal. All of your work contributed to this wonderful event, discussion, and piece of evidence of the work that's out there as well. Don't forget to download the journal, and please do follow our work. You can follow us at Glencree Centre on Facebook and Twitter, and that's where we will be posting the link in the next couple of days, probably in about a week, to the recording of this event if you do want to go back and rewatch sections or all of it. And it will also be available on our website as well, so you can check back there. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful Wednesday. Bye-bye.